On Father's Day, my own daughter slammed her fist on the table of a five-star restaurant and screamed at the top of her lungs, "Apologize to my husband right now, or you are no longer my father." Her husband, a man who had just insulted my late wife's memory, to my face sat back and smirked into his $300 glass of wine. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I stood up and looked at the child I had sacrificed my entire life to raise, said 3 words, and walked away. 3 days later, they were standing on my porch in the pouring rain, begging for mercy. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their perfect, entitled lives, let me know where you are watching this from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect is earned, not owed. My name is Warren. I am 64 years old, and for 4 decades I worked as a heavy machinery mechanic. I spent my life covered in diesel grease, nursing aching joints and pulling double shifts so my family would never know the sting of poverty. My hands are permanently calloused, scarred from slipped wrenches and hot engine blocks. But those hands built a life. Those hands paid for my daughter Rachel's out-of-state college tuition in full. Those hands paid for her extravagant wedding. I always thought that if I gave her everything I never had, she would grow up to be a compassionate, grounded woman. I was wrong. The realization did not happen all at once. It was a slow, agonizing slide into disrespect. But the absolute breaking point occurred this past Father's Day. Rachel had invited me to a dinner at the Oak Room, an upscale, ridiculously overpriced steakhouse in the heart of the city. I arrived 10 minutes early wearing my best pressed flannel shirt and a clean pair of dark jeans. It was the nicest outfit I owned since my wife Evelyn passed away 3 years ago. When Rachel and her husband Trevor finally arrived 20 minutes late, the tone for the evening was set immediately. Trevor, a 30-something tech bro who wore suits that cost more than my first car, did not even offer to shake my hand. He slid into the leather booth, snapped his fingers at the waiter, and ordered a bottle of imported Cabernet without asking what anyone else wanted. Rachel barely looked at me. She spent the first 20 minutes of dinner intensely focused on her smartphone, her thumbs flying across the screen. When she did speak, it was only to complain about the traffic or the valet service. I sat there in the dim amber lighting of the restaurant, listening to the clinking of silver cutlery, feeling like a ghost haunting my own life. Then Trevor set his sights on me. He leaned across the crisp white tablecloth, his eyes mocking. He pointed his fork at my hands. Still refusing to use moisturizer, Warren, he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "You know you don't have to play the rugged blue-collar character anymore. You're retired. You can wash the dirt off now." I looked down at my hands. The grease stains were permanent, embedded deep in the skin. They were a badge of honor. I looked at Rachel, expecting her to defend me or at least change the subject. She did not even look up from her phone. She just let out a small, embarrassed sigh. "It's not an act, Trevor," I replied calmly, keeping my temper in check. "It's a lifetime of honest work." Trevor chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "Right, honest work. Well, speaking of work, Rachel and I wanted to talk to you about something important." He shifted in his seat, suddenly adopting the slick, rehearsed tone of a salesman pitching a bad deal. He began talking about a revolutionary new app he was developing. He threw around meaningless corporate buzzwords like synergy, market disruption, and scalable liquidity. I listened in silence as the waiter brought our food. I knew exactly where this was going. I had seen this performance before. "The thing is," Warren Trevor continued, cutting into his dry, aged ribeye, "we are in the final stages of securing our seed funding, but we need a bridge loan to cover immediate operational costs. We need liquidity." "I'm retired, Trevor," I said plainly. "I live on a fixed pension." Trevor waved his hand dismissively. "We don't need your pension cash, Warren. We know you don't have that kind of liquid capital, but you do have assets." He leaned in closer, dropping the friendly facade. "We need the deed to the lakeside cabin." My heart stopped. The cabin. It was a small, beautiful A-frame property up in the mountains that Evelyn and I had bought 30 years ago. We had spent our summers there. We had painted the deck together. It was the place where my wife had spent her final peaceful months before the cancer took her. It was not just a piece of real estate. It was the last tangible piece of my marriage. No, I said. It was a single firm word. Trevor blinked clearly, unaccustomed to being denied. Warren, you're not listening. We aren't asking for a handout. We're going to leverage the property for a short-term business loan. You'll get it back in 2 years tops. I said, no, Trevor. That cabin belonged to Evelyn. It holds our memories. It is not collateral for your startup. Trevor's face flushed with sudden anger. The slick salesman vanished, replaced by a cruel, arrogant child throwing a tantrum. Memories. Warren, you are sitting on prime real estate letting it rot because of nostalgia. You are being completely irrational. It is my property, I said, my voice dropping an octave. And the discussion is over. Trevor slammed his fork down. The sound echoed loudly, drawing the attention of nearby tables. This is exactly why you'll always be a mechanic, he sneered, his voice rising in volume. You have zero financial literacy. You let sentimentality ruin good business. And honestly, Evelyn was the exact same way. The mention of my wife's name coming out of his mouth felt like a physical blow. Do not speak about my wife, I warned him, my hands clenching into fists under the table. Trevor didn't back down. He leaned forward, his eyes cold and vicious. Why not? It's the truth. Evelyn was a small-town nobody who never understood real money. She held you back your entire life, and now you are letting her ghost hold us back. It's pathetic. The air in my lungs turned to ice. A red haze crept into the edges of my vision. I had tolerated his disrespect towards me for years, but insulting the woman who had brought our daughter into this world was a line no one was allowed to cross. I turned to Rachel, the daughter I had carried on my shoulders. The daughter I had read to sleep every night. Rachel, I said, my voice trembling with suppressed fury. Tell your husband to apologize right now. Rachel finally put her phone down. She looked at Trevor, then looked at me. Her expression was not one of shock or anger or shame. It was pure, unadulterated irritation. She looked at me as if I were a misbehaving toddler embarrassing her in public. She slammed her fist on the table, rattling the expensive crystal glasses. Are you kidding me, Dad? She yelled, completely indifferent to the stares of the other patrons. You are embarrassing us. Trevor is trying to build a future for our family, and you are being stubborn over a decaying old shack in the woods. He insulted your mother, I said, staring at her in disbelief. He is telling the truth, Rachel snapped back, her voice dripping with venom. Mom was obsessed with that stupid cabin. And now you're acting just like her. You are being entirely unreasonable. Now you need to apologize to my husband right now, or you are no longer my father. The silence that followed was absolute. The background noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away entirely. I looked at Trevor. He was sitting back in his plush leather chair, swirling the red wine in his glass. A triumphant, arrogant smirk plastered across his face. He had won. He had turned my own flesh and blood against me. I looked back at Rachel. I searched her eyes for any trace of the little girl who used to hold my hand while we walked through the park. I searched for any ounce of empathy, any spark of love. There was nothing. Just a cold, entitled stranger who saw me as an obstacle to her next paycheck. In that single devastating moment, the fatherly guilt that had kept me tethered to this toxic dynamic evaporated completely. The invisible strings of obligation shattered. I did not yell. I did not make a scene. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a $5 bill, and laid it gently on the table. That is for my black coffee, I said, my voice eerily calm. I stood up, pushing my chair back. I looked down at the two of them. I am done. Those 3 words were not a threat. They were a promise. I turned around and walked out of the restaurant, leaving them sitting at the table. I didn't look back. As I stepped out into the cool evening air, I didn't feel the crushing grief of a father losing a daughter. I felt the dangerous crystal-clear focus of a man who had finally been pushed too far. They thought they were dealing with a broke, helpless old mechanic who would eventually cave to their demands. They had no idea who they were actually dealing with. The drive back to my house took exactly 45 minutes. In the past, whenever Rachel and I had a disagreement, I would spend that drive agonizing over where I went wrong. I would grip the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, replaying every word in my head, desperately searching for the exact moment I had failed her as a father. I would wonder if working too many double shifts had damaged our bond, or if I had not been present enough. But tonight, the cab of my old Ford pickup was entirely silent. The radio was off. The windows were rolled up tight against the cool night air. There were no tears burning in my eyes. There was no heavy lump of sorrow suffocating my throat. For the first time in 30 years, my mind was perfectly crystal clear. Trevor looked at my worn-out boots and my grease-stained hands and saw a pathetic old mechanic who had nothing to offer but nostalgia. He saw a man who had barely scraped by in life. Rachel looked at me and saw an embarrassment she had to tolerate. What that arrogant young man never bothered to learn was that while I was pulling 12-hour shifts at the heavy machinery plant, my late wife Evelyn and I were building something quietly in the background. We were reading thick law books. We were studying zoning regulations and property auctions late into the night at our scratched kitchen table. Decades ago, when the city first started expanding outwards, we took every spare penny we had saved in old coffee jars and bought up barren plots of commercial land on the dusty outskirts of town. Our friends called us crazy. They said dirt was just dirt. But 10 years later, the city built a massive commercial highway right through that exact dirt. We sold half the parcels to massive corporate developers and reinvested every single cent of the profits into prime commercial real estate. We built a silent empire. We became multimillionaires before Rachel even entered high school. We actively chose to hide our wealth. Evelyn and I agreed that growing up with too much money breeds a specific kind of rot in the soul. We wanted our daughter to value hard work and humility, so we kept living in our modest suburban home. I kept driving my old truck. I kept working at the plant because I loved the honest ache of physical labor and the camaraderie of my crew. We wanted to stay grounded in reality, but somehow the rot of entitlement found its way into Rachel anyway, the very moment she met Trevor. I pulled into my driveway. The neighborhood was deeply asleep. The house was dark and quiet, just the way Evelyn had left it. I walked through the front door, did not bother to turn on the living room lights, and headed straight down the narrow hallway to my small home office. I sat down in my worn leather desk chair and booted up my computer. The hum of the machine was the only sound in the room. The bright glow of the monitor cast long shadows against the walls, illuminating framed photos of a family that no longer existed. For 3 long years, I had watched Trevor strut around the city playing the role of a highly successful tech visionary. I had watched Rachel parade her designer clothes and luxury cars, acting as if she had married a genius entrepreneur. I had sat at holiday dinners listening to them mock my simple lifestyle and traditional values, but they did not know the absolute reality of their own existence. I logged into a highly secure banking portal, navigating through multiple layers of encrypted authentication. I opened the dashboard for a corporate account registered under an anonymous holding company I had created. 3 years ago, when Trevor's so-called brilliant app was about to collapse for the first time, and Rachel came to me sobbing uncontrollably about how they might lose everything they had, I made a silent choice. I could not bear to see my only daughter suffer, so I hired a discreet intermediary. Through that anonymous holding company, I became the silent angel investor for Trevor's miserable failure of a business. Every single month for 36 months, I had been automatically wiring 80% of the exorbitant rent for his sleek downtown office space. Without my anonymous monthly transfer of $8,000, his company would have been evicted years ago. He thought his brilliant business acumen was keeping the lights on. It was my grease-stained hands paying his bills, but my foolish, desperate generosity did not stop there. I clicked over to another tab on the banking screen. The lease on Rachel's top-of-the-line luxury SUV was legally in her name, but the payments were automatically deducted from a blind trust I had set up entirely for her benefit. $1,500 a month just so she could feel superior to her friends and maintain the illusion of absolute success. Sitting there in the dark, looking at the glowing numbers on the screen, the full, crushing weight of my mistake crashed over me. I thought I was protecting my little girl. I thought I was being a good, supportive father by silently carrying their financial burdens so they could chase their lofty dreams. Instead, I had subsidized my own abuse. I had financed the very arrogance that allowed her husband to sit across from me tonight and insult my dead wife. I had built a velvet-lined safety net so thick and so comfortable that they completely forgot how to respect the ground beneath them. I rested my hand on the computer mouse. My finger hovered over the primary control dashboard for the holding company. I thought about Rachel slamming her fist on the expensive restaurant table. I thought about her demanding I apologize to a man who called her mother a small town. Nobody. The cold clarity in my chest turned into something much harder. It turned into iron. I clicked the mouse. I navigated to the automatic transfer authorizations. With a single keystroke, I permanently canceled the monthly $8,000 wire to Trevor's commercial landlord. The screen flashed a confirmation message. The office rent was gone. I moved to the blind trust paying for Rachel's vehicle. I selected the automatic disbursement setting and terminated the agreement. Another confirmation message appeared. The luxury car payments were gone. There was one final thread tying me to their illusion of elite success. 2 years ago, when they wanted to move into an exclusive penthouse condo in the city's most expensive district, their combined credit scores were abysmal. The property management company practically laughed them out of the building. Rachel had called me hyperventilating, saying it was her dream home and she needed it to maintain her social status. Once again, I played the fool. I contacted the property management firm directly through my lawyers and signed on as a secret confidential guarantor for their lease. My pristine credit and massive liquid assets were the absolute only reason they were handed the keys to that luxury apartment. I opened my email client and drafted a formal, legally binding message to the leasing office. I typed out a clear and immediate revocation of my status as the guarantor on their residential lease. I cited a sudden shift in family financial dynamics and officially withdrew my backing effective immediately. I hit send. I watched the email disappear into the digital void. I sat back in my chair and listened to the silence of the room. In less than 15 minutes, I had completely dismantled the financial foundation of their entire world. The safety net that had caught them every single time they stumbled had simply ceased to exist. They had demanded that I disappear from their lives. They had declared that I was no longer a father to them. I was merely honoring their request. They wanted to live as independent, superior elites who did not need a dirty mechanic holding them back. Now they would finally get the chance to see exactly how much their flashy lifestyle truly cost. They would have to face the real world entirely on their own. I closed the laptop. The room went pitch black. I felt lighter than I had in years. I walked into my bedroom, laid down on my side of the bed, and for the first time since my wife passed away, I fell into a deep and completely untroubled sleep. Tomorrow the sun would rise, and the reality of what they had done would hit them like a freight train. Monday morning arrived in the city, with its usual frantic, unforgiving energy. Trevor was sitting at a prime corner table in a high-end bistro, wearing a tailored navy suit, pitching his hollow app to a potential venture capital investor. He wanted to project the image of a man who held the world at his fingertips. He signaled for the check with an arrogant snap of his fingers, sliding his heavy premium metal credit card onto the small leather tray without even bothering to look at the total. He continued talking smoothly, leaning back in his chair, completely confident in his fabricated success. A few minutes later, the waiter returned. The waiter leaned in close, his voice hushed and apologetic. He informed Trevor that the card had been declined. Trevor let out a quick, dismissive laugh. He told the investor it was simply a strict fraud protection algorithm, triggered by his high volume of weekend spending. He reached into his designer wallet, pulled out a second premium card, and handed it over with a tight smile. The waiter returned even faster this time. The second card was also declined. The investor cleared his throat, suddenly checking his expensive watch and muttering a polite excuse about a tight schedule. Trevor watched his potential funding walk out the glass doors, his face burning with a sudden, unfamiliar heat of humiliation. He marched outside onto the busy sidewalk and dialed his bank, ready to scream at a customer service representative. After 10 agonizing minutes on hold, a supervisor informed him that the anonymous corporate account that handled his office rent and backed his credit lines had completely severed all ties. The accounts were permanently frozen due to insufficient personal collateral. Across town, Rachel was walking out of an exclusive boutique fitness studio, holding an expensive organic smoothie and adjusting her oversized designer sunglasses. She pressed the button on her key fob to unlock her pristine luxury SUV parked on the street. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed the name of the elite auto dealership where she had leased the vehicle. She answered cheerfully, expecting a courtesy call about her upcoming detailing appointment. Instead, the sharp, unsympathetic voice of the dealership finance manager greeted her. He informed her that the primary guarantor on her lease agreement had officially and legally withdrawn their financial backing early that morning. Because Rachel and Trevor possessed abysmal personal credit and insufficient verifiable income to carry the lease on their own, the contract was now in default. The manager told her that unless she could produce $80,000 in cash by Wednesday afternoon, a repossession team would be dispatched to collect the vehicle from her building. Rachel scoffed loudly into the phone. She told the manager he was making a ridiculous mistake. She reminded him that her husband was a highly successful tech executive. The manager was completely unmoved by her attitude. He simply repeated the legal warning and hung up. Rachel stood on the sidewalk staring at her gleaming car, her heart pounding with a sudden confusing panic. Trevor and Rachel met back at their luxury downtown condo an hour later. The initial panic quickly dissolved into a blinding, arrogant rage. They put the pieces together. The frozen credit cards, the revoked lease guarantee the severed commercial office rent. It was Warren. They did not feel a single ounce of guilt for their behavior at the restaurant. They did not stop to realize that their entire glamorous existence was completely dependent on the aging mechanic they had treated like dirt. Instead, they doubled down on their absolute entitlement. They convinced themselves that Warren was simply throwing a petty childish tantrum because his feelings were hurt over dinner. They assumed he had driven down to a local bank branch and made a noisy scene to temporarily pause the accounts. They believed they still held all the real power. They believed Warren would eventually crawl back, desperate for their approval, desperate to remain a part of their sophisticated lives. Trevor paced the hardwood floors of their sprawling living room, his face red with anger. He pulled out his smartphone, hit a button, and put the phone to his ear. He was going to put the old man back in his place once and for all. Trevor spoke into the phone with a vicious, venomous tone. He told Warren that his little stunt with the bank was the most pathetic thing he had ever witnessed. He yelled that real men handle their problems face to face instead of crying to bank tellers like cowards. He demanded that Warren march back into whatever branch he had visited and fix the glitch immediately. He reminded Warren that he was just a retired grease monkey who did not understand how corporate finance worked, and that his little tantrum was jeopardizing millions of dollars in important business deals. Trevor then delivered his final arrogant threat. He told Warren that if the accounts were not fully restored by noon, Rachel would block his number, ban him from their condo, and cut him out of their lives forever. He ended the message by demanding a formal apology for the inconvenience. He hung up the phone, looking at Rachel with a smug expression, certain that the threat of absolute isolation would force the lonely old man to surrender immediately. Miles away in the quiet suburbs, the morning sun was streaming warmly through the kitchen window of my home. I was sitting at the same wooden table where I used to help Rachel with her spelling homework 30 years ago. I was drinking a hot cup of black coffee. The house was perfectly silent, completely removed from the chaos I had unleashed in the city. My cell phone sat on the table next to my mug. The screen lit up, showing a new voicemail from Trevor. I pressed play and put the phone on speaker. Trevor's angry, condescending voice filled the quiet kitchen. I listened to his insults. I listened to him call me a coward and a grease monkey. I listened to his hollow threats about cutting me out of their lives. I did not feel a rush of anger. I did not feel the familiar heavy guilt of a father worrying about his daughter. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, stabilizing confirmation that I had done the exact right thing. They were completely blind to the reality of their situation. They thought this was a temporary glitch. They had no idea that the ground beneath their feet had already crumbled into dust. The voicemail ended with a sharp click, leaving the kitchen in silence once again. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter taste. I looked out the window at the old oak tree in my backyard, feeling a profound sense of peace wash over me. They thought a simple threat of silence would break me. They thought I feared being alone. What they failed to realize was that I had already lost my daughter the moment she allowed that man to disrespect her mother. I picked up my phone, entirely ignoring the barrage of angry text messages flooding my screen. I scrolled down my contacts list until I found the direct line for my lawyer, Carmichael. I pressed the call button and listened to the dial tone, ready to initiate a full legal audit of my estate. It was time to pull back the curtain on the rest of their lies. Carmichael occupied a corner office located on the 42nd floor of a sleek glass building in the heart of the financial district. I walked through the heavy mahogany doors wearing my usual denim jacket and scuffed work boots. The receptionist, a polished young woman, smiled warmly at me. She knew exactly who I was. I was not just another face in the waiting room. I was one of the firm's most private and substantial clients. Carmichael stepped out of his office immediately. He was a sharp man in his late 50s, possessing a mind like a steel trap. We had worked together for over 20 years, quietly navigating the complex webs of commercial real estate law and asset protection. I sat down in the leather chair opposite his massive desk. I did not waste time with small talk. I told him about the dinner. I told him about the ultimatum. I told him that I had severed the financial lifelines supporting my daughter and her arrogant husband. Carmichael listened intently, pressing his fingers together. I asked him to run a routine, comprehensive audit of my entire estate. I just wanted to be absolutely certain that every account, every deed, and every trust was completely locked down. I wanted to make sure Trevor could not find a back door into my finances when desperation finally hit him. Carmichael nodded, turning his attention to his large dual monitors. His fingers danced across the keyboard as he accessed the highly secured servers holding my portfolio. We reviewed the commercial parcels first. The leases were solid, the corporate tenants were paying on time, and the anonymous holding companies were completely impenetrable. We checked the blind trusts. Everything was perfectly intact. Then Carmichael navigated to the simplest asset in my entire portfolio. He pulled up the deed and financial records for my primary residence, the modest suburban house where my late wife and I had lived for decades. Suddenly, Carmichael stopped typing. The rhythmic clicking of his keyboard ceased, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. He leaned closer to the screen, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He took off his reading glasses, wiped them with a small cloth, and put them back on as if he could not believe what the data was showing him. He turned his monitor slightly so I could see the screen. He asked me in a very slow and measured tone if I had recently decided to leverage the equity in my home for a new investment. I stared at him, completely bewildered. I told him that my house had been paid off in full 30 years ago. I had physically burned the original mortgage papers in the backyard fire pit with my wife. I had zero debt. Carmichael let out a long, heavy breath. He tapped a specific line on the digital ledger. According to the county property records, a massive $250,000 second mortgage had been taken out against my home just 45 days ago. The air in the office suddenly felt incredibly thin. $250,000. The numbers glared at me from the bright screen, mocking my decades of careful, honest financial planning. I felt a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. Trevor had sat at that restaurant demanding the deed to my lakeside cabin, acting as though he desperately needed my help to launch his app. It was all a theatrical performance. It was a calculated distraction. He had already found a way to rob me blind, right from under my nose. I told Carmichael to pull the digital paperwork for the loan immediately. We needed to see how this was even possible. Within minutes, Carmichael bypassed the standard portals and accessed the digital repository of the lending institution. He pulled up the signed loan agreement and displayed it on the large monitor. We scrolled down past the dense legal jargon directly to the final page, stopping at the signature line. There, in bold black ink, was my name. It was a flawless, meticulous replica of my exact handwriting. It captured the specific slight upward slant of my letters. It captured the heavy pressure of the pen on the final curve of my name. It was perfect. But I had never signed that paper. My mind raced assembling the pieces of the puzzle. I thought back to the dozens of old birthday cards, tax returns, and legal documents. I kept filed away in my unlocked home office. Rachel had free reign of my house. She possessed keys to my front door. She knew exactly where I kept my records. Trevor, with his background in software development and digital rendering, possessed the exact technical skills required to scan, isolate, and perfectly replicate my signature onto a fraudulent digital contract. The betrayal cut deeper than I thought possible. The agonizing realization washed over me that my own daughter had likely handed him the very documents he used to steal from me. She had unknowingly or willingly provided the weapon used to rob her own father. But a forged signature alone was not enough to secure a $250,000 loan from an online financial institution. The document required a certified legal witness to verify the identity of the signer. I pointed to the bottom corner of the contract. Next to my forged signature rested a bright, official-looking notary seal. It belonged to a man named Vincent Cole. Carmichael stared at the digital stamp, his eyes narrowing with sudden, sharp recognition. He quickly opened a new tab on his computer and accessed the state legal database. He typed the notary's name into the search bar. The results populated instantly, and they were devastating. Vincent Cole was not a reputable professional. He was a disgraced former state official who had his notary license permanently revoked 4 years ago for facilitating widespread real estate fraud and identity theft. Trevor had not just used a random website to forge a document. He had actively sought out and hired a known criminal in the local underworld to bypass the bank's security measures and finalize the theft. This meant Trevor had deliberately planned this for weeks, moving in the shadows, coordinating with felons, to place a massive lien on the house I built with my own 2 hands. Carmichael leaned back in his leather chair, folding his hands together. The atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely. This was no longer a simple family dispute over unpaid rent or revoked car leases. It was no longer about a disrespectful son-in-law or an entitled daughter demanding apologies at a steakhouse. Carmichael looked me directly in the eyes. His voice was dead serious. He informed me that what we were looking at was a clear-cut, undeniable case of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and severe elder financial abuse. Trevor had crossed an invisible line that separated arrogance from serious life-ruining criminality. If we reported this immediately to the authorities, Trevor would be facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The financial institutions would hunt him down relentlessly. The police would be knocking on his luxury condo door before nightfall. I looked at the forged signature on the screen. I thought about Trevor's smug, arrogant face sipping his expensive wine. I thought about Rachel slamming her fist on the table, telling me I was no longer her father to defend this parasite. The cold clarity in my mind hardened into an unbreakable, absolute resolve. I looked at Carmichael and told him not to call the police just yet. I did not want Trevor to be arrested in a quick, quiet swoop. I wanted to build a trap so devastating, so legally inescapable that when the walls finally closed in, he would understand the exact magnitude of the man he had decided to cross. We were going to let him believe he was winning until the very last second. Carmichael did not waste a single second. By 3:00 that same afternoon, he had summoned a premier forensic accountant to his firm. Her name was Sylvia. She was a quiet, sharp woman who spoke entirely in numbers and data trails. I sat back in the heavy leather chair watching her connect an encrypted laptop to the main display screen in the conference room. I told her I needed to know exactly where my forged $250,000 went. I wanted every transaction tracked down to the very last penny. Sylvia did not blink. She simply began to type. The room was silent except for the rapid clicking of her keys. Trevor had always paraded around family dinners, talking about his revolutionary technology application. He threw around corporate buzzwords to sound important. He claimed he was on the verge of securing massive venture capital that would change the world. Sylvia stripped away that elaborate lie in less than 20 minutes. The corporate entity Trevor had registered was nothing but a hollow shell. There were no software developers on the payroll. There were no patents filed. There was no physical product being built. The business bank account was merely a funnel. It was a temporary holding pen designed for stolen funds to be washed and quickly distributed elsewhere. The illusion of his success was entirely fabricated from thin air. The first major chunk of my stolen money had been wired to a series of obscure offshore holding companies. Sylvia traced the routing numbers back to their true origins. They were not international technology vendors. They were illicit sports betting syndicates. Trevor was not a brilliant tech visionary. He was a desperate, compulsive gambler. The scale of his losses was absolutely staggering. He had been bleeding money for years, chasing impossible odds on professional games. He was racking up massive six-figure debts with the kind of people who do not forgive missed payments. My forged mortgage was not an investment in his bright future. It was a desperate, panicked ransom payment to save his own skin from violent bookies. He had leveraged my home to buy himself a few more months of breathing room, but the gambling debts were only the first layer of his deception. Sylvia pulled up a secondary stream of recurring payments, deducted from the stolen funds. Every single month, exactly $4,000 was wired to a luxury property management firm located on the opposite side of the city. It was an upscale gated apartment complex, far away from the condo he shared with my daughter. Sylvia pulled the lease agreement, using her investigative access. The apartment was not rented under his name. It was leased to a 24-year-old woman. My heart sank into my stomach. Sylvia pulled up security camera footage from the lobby of that building acquired through a private investigator network. The screen displayed crystal-clear video of Trevor walking into that upscale apartment building. His arm was wrapped tightly around the waist of a young woman who was certainly not my daughter. The absolute betrayal was suffocating. He had used my stolen money to fund a complete double life. He was sleeping in a bed paid for by my sweat and blood, holding a secret mistress, while my daughter blindly defended his honor. The sheer audacity of his deception was breathtaking. He had ruined my credit, forged my name, and gambled away a fortune, all while maintaining a second home for a secret lover. And he had the nerve to sit across from me at a steakhouse on Father's Day and call my late wife a small-town nobody. He was a parasite feeding off my family to sustain his miserable existence. The tragedy of it all settled heavily on my shoulders. I thought about Rachel. I thought about my only child. At that very moment, she was likely sitting in her luxury condo, furiously scrolling through her phone, entirely oblivious to the fact that her entire reality was a house of cards soaked in gasoline. She believed she had married a titan of industry. She believed I was the villain. She thought I was just a stubborn, uneducated mechanic trying to hold them back from greatness. She was actively participating in my emotional abuse, screaming at me to apologize to the very man who was systematically dismantling her future. She was defending a liar who was using her own father's stolen money to finance a mistress across town. She was blindly loyal to a ghost. A deep, agonizing fatherly instinct urged me to pick up the phone right then and there. A part of me desperately wanted to call Rachel to show her the financial files to rescue her from this monster before the inevitable crash destroyed her. I wanted to protect her, just like I had done when she was a little girl falling off her bicycle. I wanted to shield her from the horrible humiliation of knowing her husband was a fraud who was sleeping with another woman on my dime. But I stopped myself. I remembered the cold, entitled look in her eyes at the restaurant. I remembered her slamming her fist on the table and telling me I was no longer her father. I realized that if I warned her now, she would never believe me. She would call the evidence a manipulation. She would run straight back to Trevor, and he would spin another brilliant lie to make me look like a jealous, vengeful old man trying to ruin her marriage. The hardest lesson a parent ever has to learn is that you cannot save a child who absolutely refuses to be saved. If I caught her now, she would never learn how to walk on her own 2 feet. I realized with absolute crushing clarity that I had to let her fall. I had to let the illusion shatter completely. I had to let her hit absolute rock bottom. Only when she was sitting in the rubble of her fake life would she finally understand the true cost of her arrogance. Only when the repo men took her cars and the eviction notices were nailed to her door would she open her eyes to the truth. She had to feel the sting of betrayal herself. The pain of this revelation was necessary for her survival. She needed to learn that entitlement and cruelty carry a heavy, devastating price in the real world. I looked at Carmichael and Sylvia sitting across the conference table. The initial shock had faded, leaving behind a cold, calculated focus. I told them to keep digging. I wanted every single piece of dirt they could find on Trevor. I wanted to know his every move, his every debt, and his every vulnerability. We were going to let him keep playing his dangerous game. We were going to let him believe he was outsmarting everyone around him. I told Carmichael to prepare the legal framework, to isolate my assets completely, and to monitor the movement of the illicit bookies. I was not going to step in and stop the train wreck. I was going to build a solid brick wall at the end of the tracks and watch him drive straight into it at full speed. The silent adjustment of my family dynamic was no longer just about cutting off their allowance. It was about delivering a lesson so profound and so devastating that they would never forget it for the rest of their lives. I stood up from the leather chair, thanked Sylvia for her incredible, relentless work, and walked out of the office. The storm was coming rapidly, and for the very first time in my life, I was not going to offer my daughter an umbrella. She had chosen her side of the battlefield, and now she would have to weather the rain entirely on her own. By Wednesday morning, the reality of absolute financial ruin had firmly settled over Rachel and Trevor. Their luxury cars were gone. Their premium credit cards were useless plastic. They were drowning in the shallow end of the fake life they had built. A normal person would have stopped to reflect. A normal daughter might have driven to my house, knocked on the door, and asked for forgiveness. But Rachel did not possess a normal conscience. Instead of feeling remorse, she felt cornered. And when entitled people feel cornered, they do not apologize. They attack. I was sitting in my kitchen drinking my morning coffee when my cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Carmichael containing a single link to a social media platform. I tapped the screen. The video that played made the blood in my veins turn to absolute ice. There was my daughter sitting on her expensive beige sofa looking directly into the camera. She was not wearing her usual heavy makeup. Her hair was intentionally messy. She looked exhausted, vulnerable, and perfectly fragile. And she was crying. Real heavy tears streamed down her cheeks as she spoke to her thousands of followers. She told a story that was so twisted and so masterfully manipulated that for a split second, I almost did not recognize the man she was talking about. She told the camera that her father, The man who had been her hero was rapidly deteriorating from aggressive early-onset dementia. She claimed that my mind was completely gone and that I had become dangerously erratic and intensely paranoid. She wiped a tear from her eye and whispered that I was financially abusing her and Trevor. She told the world that I had locked away all the family funds in a fit of psychotic delusion, leaving her completely penniless and terrified for her safety. She begged her followers for prayers. She linked a crowdfunding page to help cover her supposed emergency legal fees and basic living expenses. She claimed I was hoarding secret wealth while deliberately starving my own family out of spite. She told her audience that she feared for her physical safety because my mind was deteriorating so rapidly that I might become violent. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. She was leveraging the very real tragedy of cognitive decline to fund a lifestyle she refused to work for. She played the role of the devoted, heartbroken daughter trying to save a father who had lost his mind. It was an Oscar-worthy performance. It was also the most purely evil thing I had ever witnessed in my entire 64 years on this earth. I closed the video and set the phone face down on the table. The sheer audacity of her lies was suffocating. I had spent 4 decades building a spotless reputation in my community. I was the mechanic who fixed my neighbors' cars for free when they were going through hard times. I was the man who always kept his word. In less than 5 minutes, my own flesh and blood had painted me as a deranged, abusive lunatic. The fallout was immediate and devastating. I decided to drive to the local hardware store to pick up some gardening supplies, simply needing to clear my head. The moment I walked through the sliding glass doors, the atmosphere shifted. People I had known for 20 years suddenly stopped talking. A woman I used to attend church with grabbed her purse and quickly walked down another aisle, avoiding my gaze. The owner of the store, a man I had known since we were both young men trying to build our lives, stood behind the cash register, avoiding my eyes completely. He pretended to be deeply engrossed in a stack of inventory receipts. He rushed through my transaction without speaking a single word. That silence hurt worse than any direct accusation. They had all seen the video. They all believed the crying young woman over the silent, stoic old man. The Whisper campaign had successfully poisoned my entire community against me. I walked out of the store feeling a heavy, isolating weight pressing down on my chest. Rachel had not just stolen my peace. She had effectively erased my dignity in the eyes of my neighbors. But the public humiliation was only the smokescreen. The real danger was moving quietly in the background. When I returned home, Carmichael called me on a secure line. The private investigator we had hired to track Trevor had intercepted alarming new information. Trevor was leveraging Rachel's viral video for a much darker purpose. The video was never just about getting sympathy or gathering a few $1,000s in online donations. It was a calculated legal strategy. They were establishing a public documented record of my supposed insanity. They were building a narrative. Carmichael explained that Trevor had urgently contacted a disgraced local physician named Dr. Wallace. Dr. Wallace operated a shady clinic on the outskirts of the city, widely known in the criminal underworld for writing fraudulent medical evaluations and signing blank prescription pads for anyone carrying enough cash. Trevor had used the last of his hidden gambling funds to secure an off-the-books meeting with this doctor. The plan was terrifying in its simplicity. Trevor was paying Dr. Wallace to draft and sign an official binding medical directive declaring me totally, legally incompetent due to severe aggressive dementia. Dr. Wallace was going to sign a sworn affidavit stating that I was an immediate danger to myself and my family, without ever having laid eyes on me, without ever stepping foot inside my house, without conducting a single legitimate medical examination. Once that fraudulent medical directive was signed and notarized, Trevor planned to take it directly to a judge. He would use Rachel's viral video as supporting evidence of my erratic behavior. They would request an emergency injunction to assume total legal guardianship over my life, my health, and most importantly, my entire estate. I asked Carmichael why they were moving with such reckless, desperate speed. Why were they risking federal prison for a forged medical document when they could simply try to sue me in civil court. Carmichael sighed heavily through the phone. He told me that the forensic accountant had managed to uncover the exact nature of Trevor's debts. Trevor had not just borrowed money from generic bookmakers. He was deeply indebted to a violent organized gambling syndicate operating out of the city. He owed them over $200,000, and his grace period had completely expired. The investigators had intercepted a digital message sent to Trevor's phone the previous night. The message was not a friendly reminder. It was a lethal ultimatum. The syndicate had given Trevor exactly until Friday at noon to produce the cash, or they were going to start breaking bones. They knew where he lived. They knew where his wife lived. Trevor was backed into a corner surrounded by predators, and his only way out was to throw me to the wolves. He needed that forged medical directive signed and stamped by Thursday evening. He intended to march into the bank on Friday morning, present the legal guardianship papers, seize control of my checking accounts, and instantly liquidate the deed to my house to pay off the violent criminals hunting him down. I sat in my home office, digesting the sheer gravity of the situation. My daughter, the girl I had protected from every hardship in life, was the smiling, weeping public face of a campaign designed to lock me inside a psychiatric ward. Her husband was actively forging medical documents to hand my life savings over to violent criminals just to save his own miserable skin. They honestly believed they had me trapped. They thought they had successfully isolated me from my community, destroyed my reputation, and built an airtight legal cage around my finances. They believed that by Friday afternoon, I would be heavily medicated in a locked facility, while they lived happily ever after in my house. A cold, dangerous calm washed over me. I looked at the calendar on my desk. It was Wednesday afternoon. They had set their own execution date for Friday morning. They had given me exactly 48 hours to prepare the final blow. I told Carmichael to let them proceed. I instructed him not to interfere with Dr. Wallace, not to take down Rachel's video, and not to alert the authorities just yet. I wanted Trevor to get that fake medical document in his hands. I wanted him to feel the intoxicating rush of absolute victory. I wanted him to walk into that bank on Friday morning, believing he was the smartest man in the world. Because when you want to teach a parasite a lesson, they will never forget you do not simply squash them in the dark. You let them climb all the way to the very top of their mountain of lies, and then you pull the ground out from under them in broad daylight. The countdown had officially begun, and I was going to make sure they lost everything. Thursday morning arrives with a quiet intensity. Carmichael calls me into his office before the sun has even fully risen over the city skyline. Sitting across from him is our private investigator, a man who moves like a shadow and speaks only in absolutes. He slides a plain manila folder across the heavy wooden desk. Inside lies a digital copy of the exact document Trevor purchased from the disgraced doctor. I stare at the piece of paper that is supposed to end my life as an independent man. It is a comprehensive declaration of mental incompetence. It states in cold clinical language that I suffer from severe progressive cognitive decline, making me a danger to myself and entirely incapable of managing my own financial affairs. The signature at the bottom belongs to the fraudulent doctor, a man who has never spoken a single word to me. The investigator explains the exact timeline Trevor has constructed. The violent gambling syndicate has given my son-in-law until noon on Friday to produce the $250,000 he owes them. Trevor intends to walk through the heavy glass doors of my primary bank at exactly 9 in the morning on Friday. He plans to slam this forged medical directive onto the branch manager's desk, accompanied by my daughter's tearful performance. With the document legally binding on its face, Trevor will demand immediate emergency control over my checking accounts. He plans to liquidate my available cash and immediately initiate a distress sale of my home to an all-cash buyer he has already lined up in the criminal underworld. He thinks it will take less than an hour to steal my entire life. I look at Carmichael and tell him we are not going to block Trevor from entering the bank. We are not going to call the police to intercept him at his luxury condo. We are going to let him walk right into the vault. We are going to let him present the fraudulent papers to the bank manager. We are going to let him commit federal bank fraud in broad daylight with high-definition security cameras recording his every move. Carmichael smiles a sharp, dangerous smile. But to execute this trap perfectly, we need to build a defensive wall so high and so incredibly solid that Trevor will shatter into 1,000 pieces the moment he hits it. I spend the entirety of my Thursday executing our defensive strategy. I do not go to a single local clinic or neighborhood doctor. Carmichael leverages his elite legal connections to secure immediate emergency appointments with 3 of the most respected psychiatric and neurological specialists in the entire state. These are not strip mall doctors. These are department heads at premier university hospitals. Men and women whose medical opinions are considered absolute law in federal court. I sit through hours of grueling cognitive exams. I answer complex memory recall questions. I undergo comprehensive psychological profiling. I submit to neurological reflex testing. I sit in sterile white examination rooms answering questions about my childhood, my finances, my daily routines, and my grasp on reality. Every doctor looks at me with a mixture of professional curiosity and deep respect. They do not see a senile mechanic. They see a sharp, calculating man who knows exactly what day it is and exactly how much money he holds in his accounts. By 4 p.m, I have 3 separate, heavily notarized and officially sealed medical certificates. Each one concludes the exact same thing. My brain function is exceptionally sharp. My cognitive abilities are pristine. I am in total, absolute control of my faculties with the mental acuity of a man decades younger. These 3 thick envelopes are the ultimate shield. They are the absolute, undeniable proof that my daughter and her husband are attempting to perpetrate a massive medical fraud. I place the 3 envelopes into my worn leather satchel, feeling the heavy weight of justice resting against my side. I return to the law office as the city lights begin to flicker on outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. The forensic accountant has finished compiling her master dossier. We lay out the trap piece by piece on the conference table, preparing for the final confrontation. We gather the original pristine deed to my home, proving the loan Trevor took out was a complete fabrication. We gather the digital tracking data showing Trevor wiring the stolen funds to illegal offshore sportsbooks. We have the photographs of his secret mistress walking into the apartment funded by my sweat and blood. And now we have the 3 unassailable medical certificates proving his guardianship claim is a malicious lie. Carmichael places all these documents into a sleek, black leather briefcase. Every single piece of paper is a nail in the coffin Trevor has built for himself. The trap is now fully armed and ready to spring. Friday morning dawns overcast and heavy with impending rain. I wake up before my alarm, drinking my black coffee in the silent kitchen of the house Trevor is currently trying to steal. I put on my best dark suit, the one I usually reserve for funerals. Today, it feels entirely appropriate because I am about to bury the illusion of my family. I drive downtown, feeling a deep, steady calm settling over my bones. I do not feel fear. I do not feel the agonizing heartbreak of a father losing his child. I only feel the cold, mechanical precision of a man who is about to correct a terrible mistake. I pull into the underground parking garage of my bank at 8 a.m, a full hour before Trevor is scheduled to arrive. Carmichael is already waiting for me in the lobby. We walk together to the office of the branch manager, a man named Harrison, who has managed my legitimate accounts for over 15 years. Harrison trusts me implicitly. Carmichael quietly explains the situation to Harrison, presenting the digital copy of the forged medical directive our investigator intercepted. Harrison turns pale, recognizing the sheer scale of the attempted bank fraud about to take place in his lobby. Carmichael instructs Harrison to act completely normal when Trevor arrives. He tells the manager to accept the fake documents to feign professional concern and to escort Trevor and Rachel directly into this very office without alerting them to our presence. Miles away across the city, Trevor is driving his rented sedan through the morning traffic. Our private investigator is tailing him, sending Carmichael real-time location updates via text message. I can vividly picture the scene inside their car. Trevor is gripping the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with a mixture of desperate panic and arrogant anticipation. The violent bookies are demanding their money by noon. He believes he is rushing toward his ultimate salvation. Beside him sits Rachel, rehearsing her fake tears, dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue, preparing to play the role of the heartbroken daughter, forced to institutionalize her father. They are entirely convinced that their plan is flawless. They believe I am sitting alone in my suburban home wearing an old flannel shirt, completely unaware that my financial execution is minutes away. They think they have outsmarted the old grease monkey. The investigator texts that Trevor has parked his car across the street from the bank. I sit in a high-backed leather chair in the corner of Harrison's office, hidden from the main lobby windows. Carmichael sits beside me, his black briefcase resting squarely on his lap. My heart does not race. My hands do not shake. I feel the absolute terrifying stillness of a man who has finally accepted the death of his family. I listen to the heavy tick of the wall clock, counting down the final seconds of Trevor's freedom. The bank opens its doors to the public. Through the frosted glass of the office door, I see the silhouette of my daughter pushing open the main entrance. Trevor is walking right behind her, clutching a manila folder tight against his chest. He marches toward the teller line with the aggressive posture of a man who believes he owns the world. He has no idea that every step he takes is pulling the noose tighter around his own neck. The trap is set. The bait has been taken. The predators have walked willingly into the cage. Through the frosted glass of Harrison's office, I watched the main lobby of the bank. The heavy double doors swung open, and Trevor walked in first. He wore a sharp, tailored navy suit with his chin held high, projecting the absolute confidence of a man who believed he held all the winning cards in his hand. Rachel trailed slightly behind him. She was intentionally dressed down, wearing minimal makeup and holding a crumpled tissue. She was playing the role of the exhausted, heartbroken daughter to absolute perfection. She looked exactly like a woman carrying the heavy, tragic burden of committing her father to a psychiatric facility. It physically sickened me to see how easily my own flesh and blood slipped into such a vicious lie. Trevor did not wait in the normal customer line. He bypassed the velvet ropes completely and marched directly to the main teller counter, tapping his knuckles on the polished marble to demand immediate attention. I could not hear his exact words through the thick glass walls of the manager's office, but I could read his aggressive, entitled body language. He slapped the manila folder containing the forged medical directive onto the counter. He pointed to the papers with a demanding, sharp gesture. The young teller had been thoroughly briefed by Harrison just 20 minutes prior, and he played his part brilliantly. The teller looked at the fraudulent document, widened his eyes in feigned professional concern, and nodded rapidly. He respectfully asked them to follow him to the branch manager's office to handle such sensitive legal matters. Trevor turned to Rachel and offered her a reassuring, arrogant smile. He likely whispered something to her about how easy this entire process was going to be. They followed the teller across the wide, polished marble floor. Every step they took echoed deep in my chest, not with fear, but with a profound, quiet grief. This was the final march of my family. I was watching my only child willingly participate in my absolute destruction just to maintain her luxury lifestyle. The teller stopped in front of Harrison's office, knocked twice, opened the heavy oak door, and gestured for them to step inside. Trevor stepped through the doorway first, with his chest puffed out, holding the fraudulent papers like a hard-won trophy. Rachel walked in right behind him, wiping a fake tear from her cheek. Harrison sat behind his massive desk, keeping his face an emotionless professional mask. Trevor opened his mouth to begin his rehearsed speech about his tragically ill father-in-law. Then he turned his head toward the corner of the room. He saw Carmichael sitting quietly in the leather guest chair. Then his eyes shifted and locked directly onto me. I was sitting completely still with my calloused hands resting on my knees, looking back at him with the cold, dead eyes of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. The arrogant smirk vanished from Trevor's face so fast, it looked as if he had been physically struck by a baseball bat. All the color drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly pale white. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound managed to escape his throat. Rachel let out a sharp, involuntary gasp. The crumpled tissue she had been using for her fake tears fell from her trembling hand onto the carpet. She took a stumbling step backward, bumping hard into the heavy wooden doorframe. They stood there, completely frozen, in absolute shock, staring at the senile retired mechanic they thought was miles away in the suburbs, waiting to be dragged into a padded cell. "Welcome, Trevor," I said. My voice was low and steady, cutting through the heavy silence of the room like a razor blade. "You are running a little late, but we have been waiting patiently for you." Trevor swallowed hard. His eyes darted frantically around the room, rapidly assessing the trap he had just walked blindly into. He tried desperately to recover his slick, confident persona. He puffed his chest back out, attempting to project authority, and took a stiff step toward the desk. He stammered my name, his voice cracking slightly under the immense pressure. He asked what I was doing in the city and insisted that I was not well. He claimed I was supposed to be at home resting, and told Harrison that they possessed legal documentation from a licensed doctor stating that I needed immediate medical intervention. He slammed the forged medical directive onto Harrison's desk, trying to assert his dominance. Carmichael did not even bother to look at the fraudulent piece of paper. The lawyer slowly and deliberately reached into his black leather briefcase. He pulled out 3 thick, heavily sealed envelopes and placed them perfectly in a row next to Trevor's fake document. Carmichael looked up at Trevor with the cold, lethal precision of a predator smelling blood in the water. Carmichael introduced himself smoothly as my legal counsel. He announced that the 3 envelopes he had just placed on the desk contained independent notarized psychiatric evaluations. He specified that they were conducted just yesterday by the top neurological department heads in the state. He stated clearly that these documents officially certified that his client possessed perfect cognitive health and absolute mental acuity, completely invalidating any claim of dementia. Trevor stared at the 3 sealed envelopes as if they were live explosives. His breathing became incredibly shallow and rapid. He realized instantly that his expensive forged document was now completely worthless garbage. He realized that the violent gambling syndicate deadline was only hours away, and his $250,000 lifeline had just evaporated into thin air. He began to sweat profusely, his carefully constructed tech executive image melting away to reveal the terrified, compulsive gambler hiding underneath. Rachel looked at me with her eyes wide open in genuine panic. She whispered my name, her voice trembling violently. She pleaded with me, claiming they were just trying to help me because I had been acting so strangely. She tried to fall back on the narrative that they were just scared for my well-being. "You were scared," I repeated, standing up slowly from my leather chair. I walked closer to them, forcing Trevor to take a step back. "The only thing you were scared of, Rachel, was that I would figure out your husband took out a forged $250,000 loan against my house to pay off his illegal sports gambling debts." I watched her face contort in absolute raw confusion. She turned and looked at Trevor, seeking an immediate denial, but Trevor was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically toward the glass exit doors. "You did not know anything about the gambling, did you, Rachel?" I asked softly. "You just knew you wanted my money, and you were willing to lock your own father in a psychiatric ward to get your hands on it." I turned my attention to Harrison, who was watching the entire scene unfold with absolute professional disgust. I spoke clearly, ensuring every single word carried absolute legal weight. I told the bank manager that the document this man had just handed him was a complete forgery purchased from a known criminal currently under federal investigation. I officially declared that a severe fraud attempt had just occurred inside his bank. I demanded that bank security and the federal authorities be notified immediately. Carmichael pulled out his cell phone and held it up, showing Trevor that he was already dialing the numbers. The word federal shattered whatever tiny fragment was left of Trevor's composure. Total blinding panic completely took over his body. He knew he was standing inside a federally insured bank surrounded by high-definition security cameras, holding a fraudulent piece of paper that could easily send him to a penitentiary for 20 years. He did not try to argue his case. He did not try to explain away the forgery. He acted purely on the animal instinct to survive. He reached out and grabbed Rachel roughly by the arm, yanking her violently toward the open office door. Rachel cried out, stumbling in her expensive shoes as he dragged her out of the room. Trevor completely ignored her protests. He shoved the heavy glass door open and bolted across the vast marble lobby, sprinting like a hunted animal. The bank teller shouted for the security guards stationed near the entrance, but Trevor was moving too fast, fueled by pure adrenaline and terror. He crashed through the main entrance doors, dragging my crying daughter out into the busy city street, before the guards could even leave their posts to intercept him. I stood quietly in the manager's office and watched them run away. I watched the final lingering illusion of my family disappear forever into the morning traffic. Harrison let out a long, heavy breath and used a pair of tweezers to carefully pick up the forged document, placing it into a clear plastic evidence bag. The trap had sprung perfectly, catching them in the act. They had left their fingerprints all over a massive federal crime. But I knew Trevor was now an incredibly desperate man with a violent syndicate breathing down his neck. He had completely run out of options, which meant it was exactly the right time for me to execute the most ruthless financial maneuver of my entire life. The heavy glass doors of the bank swung shut, cutting off the frantic sounds of my daughter and her husband running down the street. I remained in the manager's office watching the dust settle. The immediate crisis of the forged medical directive had been neutralized, but my work was far from over. Trevor was a desperate animal backed into a dark corner. Through our private investigator, we knew the violent gambling syndicate he owed money to was not going to accept a bank delay as an excuse. By noon that very same Friday, Trevor received a terrifying digital message on his phone. It was an absolute lethal ultimatum. The syndicate gave him exactly 24 hours to produce the $250,000 in cash. If the money was not in their hands by Saturday afternoon, they promised they would stop asking politely and start sending people to his luxury condo to break bones. He was a hunted man running out of time and oxygen. A normal father might have felt a twinge of pity or fear for his daughter being caught in the crossfire of such a dangerous world. But I knew Rachel was not a hostage. She was an active participant in my attempted destruction. I could not allow emotion to cloud my judgment. I turned to Carmichael and told him it was time to execute the final financial maneuver. Trevor was scrambling to find a way to appease the syndicate, but I was going to make sure he had absolutely no ground left to stand on. We left the bank and immediately returned to the law firm where our forensic accountant Sylvia was already waiting with a new stack of heavily detailed dossiers. Sylvia had spent the morning mapping out the legitimate side of Trevor's financial life. Before he had descended entirely into degenerate sports gambling and fraud, Trevor had managed to secure several legitimate business loans to fund his hollow technology startup. He had fooled 3 separate private lenders into backing his company with substantial lines of credit. These were legitimate businessmen who believed they were investing in a promising new application. The total legitimate debt amounted to nearly $300,000. Trevor was currently in technical default on all these loans, but the lenders were still going through the slow, agonizing process of standard corporate collection. They were sending polite warning letters and leaving voicemails unaware that their money had already been squandered on a secret mistress and illegal sports bets. I sat down at the heavy oak conference table and looked at the names of the 3 private lenders. I told Carmichael to contact them immediately. I instructed him to use my anonymous offshore holding company to present them with a highly unusual but incredibly lucrative offer. I was going to use the vast hidden liquidity I had built over 40 years of grueling mechanic work and quiet real estate investments to buy Trevor's debt. I authorized Carmichael to offer these lenders a full cash buyout of the debt at a 20% premium above the face value. They would get all their lost money back instantly, plus a handsome profit, and in exchange they would sign the promissory notes directly over to my holding company. The sheer amount of cash required for this maneuver was staggering, but my resources were deep, and my resolve was absolute. Carmichael and his team of corporate lawyers moved with terrifying speed. Within 3 hours, the deals were struck. The private lenders, tired of chasing a ghost, gladly took the premium cash payout and legally transferred the debt obligations. By 3 o'clock that Friday afternoon, the ink was dry on the transfer agreements. I effectively became Trevor's sole legal creditor. I literally owned every single aspect of his professional existence. I owned the paper on his business. I owned the leverage on his life. Carmichael placed the newly acquired promissory notes in front of me. I did not buy this debt simply to hold it over his head. I bought it to destroy his remaining sanctuary. I pointed to the dense paragraphs of fine print at the bottom of the original loan contracts. Every commercial lending agreement contains a specific standard clause regarding the misuse of funds. It is known as the Fraud and Misrepresentation Clause. The clause explicitly states that if the borrower uses the corporate loan money for unapproved personal expenses or illegal activities, the lender has the absolute right to call the entire debt due immediately. There would be no grace periods. There would be no 30-day warnings. The total sum was due the very second the clause was triggered. Sylvia had already meticulously documented how Trevor had diverted the business loan money to pay for his mistress's upscale apartment and his mounting gambling losses. The breach of contract was undeniable and legally bulletproof. I looked at Carmichael and gave him the order to pull the trigger. Carmichael's firm unleashed a relentless blitzkrieg of legal enforcement. They drafted the immediate demand for payment in full, citing the overwhelming forensic evidence of wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. But we did not just send a polite email to Trevor's phone. We executed the demands with aggressive physical finality. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, a team of commercial process servers accompanied by a certified locksmith arrived at the sleek downtown office building where Trevor housed his fake startup. The rent had already bounced because I had canceled my anonymous funding earlier in the week. Now the legal creditors were seizing the premises. The process servers presented the property management with the immediate default judgments and the fraud injunctions. The locksmith swiftly drilled out the locks on Trevor's office doors, replacing them with heavy industrial padlocks. Large, bright orange legal notices of commercial seizure were taped across the glass entrance. If Trevor tried to return to his office to hide or steal any remaining assets, he would be arrested for trespassing. His professional kingdom was completely shuttered and locked away from him in a matter of minutes. The devastation did not end downtown. At the exact same time, a different set of process servers arrived at the exclusive luxury high-rise where Rachel and Trevor lived. Earlier that week, I had formally and legally revoked my status as the secret guarantor on their residential lease. Without my pristine credit backing them, and with their own bank accounts frozen and heavily overdrawn, the property management company had immediately moved to protect their elite building. Because Trevor was now officially documented as a severe fraud risk by my legal team, the building managers took no chances. The process servers marched past the marble lobby and rode the elevator up to the penthouse floor. They taped a bold, undeniable notice of immediate eviction and default directly onto the polished wood of my daughter's front door. The notice demanded that they vacate the premises or face forced removal by county sheriffs. I sat in the quiet comfort of the law office looking out the window at the sprawling city below. The sky was darkening with the approaching evening storm. In a single afternoon, I had systematically dismantled every single pillar of their entitled existence. Trevor's office was padlocked and seized. His credit cards were useless plastic. His fraudulent medical scheme had blown up in his face, leaving a trail of federal evidence. The violent syndicate was counting down the hours until they came to collect their blood money. And now the luxurious sanctuary my daughter had valued more than her own father's dignity was legally declaring them trespassers. The velvet safety net was entirely gone, replaced by the cold, hard concrete of the real world. They had nowhere left to hide, and absolutely no one left to manipulate. The trap had closed completely, and now all I had to do was wait for the inevitable begging to begin. Exactly 72 hours had passed since I walked out of that upscale steakhouse. It was Wednesday evening, and the sky over the suburbs had turned a deep, bruised purple before unleashing a relentless, torrential downpour. I was standing in my warm, quiet kitchen, pouring a fresh cup of black coffee and listening to the heavy rain drumming against the roof. I knew exactly what was happening out in the city. The financial dominoes I had tipped over had finally reached the end of their line. I did not have to wait long to see the results. Through the kitchen window, I saw a battered yellow taxi pull up to the curb in front of my house. There was no sleek luxury vehicle. The dealership repo men had taken care of that early Tuesday morning, hooking the gleaming metal to a tow truck while the neighbors watched. The rear doors of this taxi opened, and two figures stepped out into the freezing rain. It was Rachel and Trevor. They did not have large umbrellas. They did not have the designer luggage they usually paraded through expensive airport lounges. They were dragging two cheap plastic trash bags filled with whatever belongings they could frantically gather before the building security escorted them out of their penthouse. The property managers had deactivated their electronic key fobs, locking them out of their own glamorous illusion. They looked entirely pathetic, dragging their feet up my driveway as the rain soaked right through their expensive clothes. The sheer arrogance they had worn like heavy armor at the restaurant was completely washed away. They did not ring the doorbell with the casual, entitled impatience they used to possess. Trevor pounded on the thick oak wood of my front door with the frantic, heavy rhythm of a hunted animal. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I set the mug down on the granite counter. I walked down the hallway and unlocked the deadbolt, pulling the heavy door wide open. The storm whipped cold water onto the porch tiles. Trevor and Rachel stood there, shivering uncontrollably under the yellow porch light. Trevor looked absolutely destroyed. His tailored suit was plastered to his skin, completely ruined by the storm. His hair was matted to his forehead, and his eyes were bloodshot and swollen. The moment I opened the door, the slick tech executive persona completely evaporated. Trevor did not try to negotiate. He did not try to project authority. He simply collapsed. He dropped the plastic trash bags onto the wet porch and fell directly to his knees on the hard concrete. He grabbed the fabric of my jeans with trembling hands. He began to weep with loud, ugly, racking sobs that echoed over the sound of the rain. "Warren, please," he begged, his voice cracking and desperate. "Please, you have to help me." They took the office. They took the cars. The bank is empty. I have nothing left and people are looking for me. He looked up at me with absolute terror in his eyes. The violent bookies were no longer a distant threat. They were a reality hunting him down. He promised he would change. He swore he would be a better man, a better husband, and a better son-in-law. He babbled uncontrollably about going to therapy, about finding a real honest job, about paying me back every single penny if I just wrote a check to save his life. He groveled at the feet of the man he had called a greasy, uneducated mechanic just 72 hours prior. He was begging a small-town nobody for his very survival. I looked down at him and felt absolutely nothing. I felt no pity and no satisfaction. I just looked at a parasite who had finally run out of hosts to feed on. When Trevor failed to elicit a single reaction from me, Rachel stepped forward. She was shivering violently, her expensive makeup running down her face in dark, messy streaks. Instead of showing any genuine remorse, she defaulted to the only weapon she knew how to use. She tried to leverage her position as my child. She tried to weaponize my fatherly love. "Dad, how can you just stand there and do nothing?" She cried, her voice shrill and accusatory. "We are your family. I am your only daughter. We have been kicked out into the street. We have no money for a hotel, and my friends will not even answer my calls." She stepped closer, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. She demanded to know how I could be so cruel. She asked how a father could let his own flesh and blood become homeless over a simple misunderstanding at a dinner. She was still trying to twist the narrative to make me the villain of the story, wrapping her toxic entitlement in a plea for salvation. She wept and pleaded, claiming that my late wife, Evelyn, would be disgusted and heartbroken to see me treat my only child this way. She invoked her mother's name, trying to pry open my wallet with heavy guilt. She told me I had to fix this glitch with the bank right now because she was scared and cold and needed to sleep in her old bedroom. I stood in the doorway, letting the cold rain blow against my face. I listened to the weeping of the man who had forged my signature and stolen $250,000 from my estate. I listened to the emotional blackmail of the daughter who had publicly humiliated me and demanded I apologize to her abuser. I remembered the long nights I worked until my hands bled to buy her a bicycle. I remembered the holding company I had funded for years to keep their fake life afloat. They were still completely blind to the depth of their own betrayal. They still thought this was just about a canceled credit card and a revoked lease. I did not raise my voice. I did not tell them they deserved to stand in the rain. I simply looked at Trevor kneeling in puddles on my porch and Rachel sobbing into her wet hands. I maintained a completely emotionless mask. My face was carved from stone. I stepped back into the warm, dry hallway and opened the door a little wider. "Come inside," I said, my voice flat and hollow. "Leave those wet bags on the porch and sit at the kitchen table." The sudden invitation caught them completely off guard. Trevor scrambled to his feet, wiping his nose on his wet sleeve, nodding furiously with a pathetic glimmer of hope in his eyes. Rachel let out a loud breath of relief, completely convinced that her emotional manipulation had worked and that Daddy was going to write a massive check to make all the bad things go away. They hurried out of the storm and walked down the hallway, dripping water onto the floorboards, taking their seats at the heavy oak table. They had absolutely no idea that I was not inviting them inside to offer a rescue. I was inviting them inside for their execution. I walked into the kitchen and took my seat directly across from them at the heavy oak table. The only sound in the room was the relentless rain beating against the window glass and the ragged breathing of the two people sitting in front of me. Trevor was shivering violently in his soaked designer suit. He looked at me with wide, desperate eyes that were practically vibrating with the foolish hope that I was about to reach for my checkbook and save his life. Rachel was dabbing her ruined makeup with a wet paper towel, letting out small, dramatic sniffles. She honestly believed that her emotional performance had worked. She believed that I was just a soft old man who could not bear to see his daughter uncomfortable in the cold. I did not offer them warm towels. I did not offer them hot coffee. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my dry coat and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. I placed it flat on the wooden surface between us. The folder contained the absolute destruction of their entire marriage. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream at them for the profound disrespect they had shown me on Father's Day. Anger requires a level of emotional investment, and I had completely run out of emotions to invest in either of them. I placed my calloused hand flat on top of the folder and looked directly into the eyes of my daughter. I told her that she needed to open the file. I told her to take a very long and very hard look at exactly what her blind, arrogant loyalty had bought her. Rachel frowned in deep confusion. She glanced nervously at Trevor, who suddenly looked extremely uneasy. His eyes darted to the folder, recognizing the thick legal binding of professional corporate documents. Rachel reached out with trembling fingers and flipped the heavy cover open. The very first page staring back at her was a high-resolution copy of the digital loan agreement. She stared at the numbers, but her brain refused to process them immediately. I broke the heavy silence. I told her that while she was busy yelling at me to apologize to her husband in that restaurant, he was busy committing federal wire fraud. I explained with cold precision that her brilliant tech executive husband had secretly hired a disgraced criminal notary to forge my signature. I watched the realization wash over her face as I told her he had placed a $250,000 second mortgage on the very house she grew up in. Rachel let out a sharp, confused gasp. Her eyes scanned the document, rapidly stopping dead when she saw the flawless replica of my signature resting right next to the official notary seal. She looked up at me and then looked over at Trevor. She asked him what this was, and her voice was barely a whisper. Trevor did not answer her. He was staring at the table with his jaw completely locked. But the forged loan was merely the beginning of the nightmare I had prepared for them. I instructed Rachel to turn the page. She flipped the heavy paper over, revealing the comprehensive forensic accounting report my team had meticulously prepared. It was a complete chronological map of the absolute financial ruin Trevor had brought upon them. I did not let him hide behind his usual corporate buzzwords and empty promises. I spoke with absolute clinical precision, stripping away every single lie he had ever told. I told Rachel that there was no revolutionary application being developed. I told her there was no technology startup and absolutely no venture capital funding waiting in the wings. I explained that her husband was nothing but a desperate, compulsive gambler who owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to a violent, illegal sports betting syndicate. I watched as her eyes darted across the columns of red numbers detailing the massive daily transfers to offshore betting accounts. She was looking at the staggering sums of money he had blown, while she blindly defended his arrogance and mocked my blue-collar life. The color completely drained from the face of my daughter. Her hands were shaking so violently that the thick paper rattled audibly against the wood of the table. She was beginning to understand that the wealthy, successful man she had married was an absolute phantom. She saw the records of thousands of dollars disappearing on random Tuesday afternoons. She saw the undeniable proof that the man sitting next to her had systematically drained every single resource he could get his hands on. But the final nail in the coffin was still waiting for her on the next sheet of paper. I told her to turn to the very last page in the folder. She hesitated, holding her breath. A deep, primal instinct was telling her that whatever was on that final page would break her beyond any hope of repair. Slowly, she turned the paper over. Staring back at her were 4 crystal-clear, high-resolution photographs provided by my private investigator. The images were taken just outside a luxury apartment complex on the other side of the city. The photos clearly showed Trevor walking toward the private entrance. His arm was wrapped intimately around the waist of a beautiful young woman who was easily 10 years younger than Rachel. They were laughing together, looking like a perfectly happy couple without a single care in the world. The woman was wearing a diamond necklace that Rachel had admired in a jewelry store window just months prior. I did not let her look away from the images. I told Rachel that the $4,000 monthly rent for that secret luxury apartment was paid for using the exact money Trevor had stolen from my forged mortgage. I explained that he was not working late nights at the downtown office building I had secretly been funding for years. He was sleeping in another woman's bed financed entirely by the theft of her own father's life savings. Rachel stared at the photographs, and her entire world completely imploded. The arrogant, entitled woman who had slammed her fist on the restaurant table just 3 days ago completely vanished from the room. She let out a horrific, agonizing sound. It was not a normal cry. It was the guttural, suffocating wail of a human being whose entire reality had just been violently ripped apart from the inside out. She turned to Trevor, expecting him to deploy one of his slick, practiced lies. She desperately wanted him to deny it. She wanted him to say it was a terrible misunderstanding, or a business partner, or a malicious manipulation. But Trevor had absolutely no lies left to tell. He was not looking at her. He was gripping the edges of the kitchen table so hard, his knuckles were bone white. He was hyperventilating, gasping for air, in short, desperate bursts, like a drowning man dragged under the freezing waves. He realized in that exact moment that the game was completely and utterly over. He realized that I had not just frozen a bank account out of spite or thrown a childish tantrum over a disrespectful comment. I had systematically uncovered every single dirty secret he had ever buried in the dark. He realized that the man sitting across from him was not a naive old mechanic who could be easily manipulated. I was an absolute executioner who had just dismantled his entire life piece by piece. The panic in his eyes was absolute and total. He looked at the front door, then looked back at the folder, realizing he was trapped inside a cage of his own making. The violent gambling syndicate was hunting him down outside in the cold storm, and inside the warmth of my house, his marriage and his freedom had just evaporated into nothing. The heavy silence in the kitchen was broken only by the relentless pounding of the rain against the window panes. I sat completely still, watching the violent psychological unraveling of the man sitting across the table. Trevor was staring at the high-resolution photographs of his secret mistress and the meticulous forensic accounting reports. His breathing had shifted from rapid, panicked gasps into something much darker and far more primal. The slick, arrogant technology executive was completely dead. What remained in that chair was a cornered, desperate animal, realizing the trap had closed around him with absolute, inescapable finality. He was a man who owed a violent gambling syndicate hundreds of thousands of dollars, and his only lifeline had just been exposed as a massive federal crime. I watched his eyes dart frantically from the paper to the front door, and then finally back to the thick manila folder resting on the oak wood. I could see the exact moment his survival instinct completely overrode his logic. In his blind, terrifying desperation, a foolish thought took root in his mind. He believed that if he could just destroy the physical documents sitting on the table, he could somehow erase the reality of his crimes. He believed he could tear the evidence to shreds and buy himself enough time to escape the city before the authorities or the violent bookies caught up with him. It was the irrational, pathetic calculation of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Trevor let out a sudden guttural scream of pure, unadulterated fury. His hands slammed down onto the edge of the kitchen table, his knuckles turning bone white as he violently shoved his body weight forward. The heavy oak wood groaned under the sudden explosive force. His coffee mug was knocked off the surface, shattering into dozens of sharp porcelain pieces against the linoleum floor. Trevor lunged his entire body directly across the table. His rain-soaked designer suit slid against the polished wood as his hands clawed wildly through the air, reaching desperately for my throat and the folder of evidence. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands to protect my face. I did not shout for him to stop or back away. I had anticipated this exact violent reaction for 3 days. I knew the fundamental anatomy of a coward. When a coward is finally stripped of his lies, his money, and his power, he will always resort to pure, blind violence. I simply leaned back slightly in my chair, keeping my expression entirely hollow and indifferent. My right hand, which had been resting calmly on my lap for the entirety of the confrontation, moved exactly 2 inches upward. I pressed my thumb firmly against a small, discreet wireless panic button that had been securely taped to the underside of the kitchen table earlier that morning. My lawyer Carmichael had insisted on this specific vital precaution. Carmichael knew that backing a severely indebted, desperate fraudster into a corner was a highly volatile equation. He had coordinated with the local police precinct hours before Rachel and Trevor had even arrived at my porch. The reaction to the button was absolutely instantaneous. Trevor's frantic fingers barely grazed the edge of the manila folder before the heavy sliding pocket doors of my adjacent darkened den were thrown violently open. 2 broad-shouldered, heavily armored municipal police officers burst into the bright kitchen. They had been standing perfectly still in the shadows of my home for the past 45 minutes. They had listened to every single word of the confrontation. They had heard the detailed list of his financial crimes, the forged signature, and the fake medical directive. The officers moved with terrifying practiced efficiency. The first officer intercepted Trevor mid-lunge, grabbing him forcefully by the collar of his ruined wet jacket and twisting his forward momentum violently sideways. The second officer swept Trevor's legs out from under him. The sudden, brutal collision of bodies sent Trevor crashing hard onto the kitchen floor. The sickening thud of his shoulder hitting the linoleum echoed loudly through the room, silencing his furious scream. Trevor thrashed wildly against the floor like a caught fish. He kicked his legs and swung his arms in a blind, pathetic panic. He screamed that it was a massive misunderstanding, that he was the real victim, and that I was a crazy, vengeful old man trying to frame him for crimes he did not commit. But his frantic protests were completely useless against the crushing weight of the two officers pinning him face down. An officer drove a heavy knee squarely into the center of Trevor's back, pressing the remaining air completely out of his lungs and forcing his face flat against the cold ground. I sat quietly and watched as his arms were forcefully wrenched behind his back. The sharp, unmistakable metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists filled the kitchen. It was the sound of absolute, inescapable finality. It was the sound of a man's future being permanently locked away behind cold iron bars. Rachel finally looked up from her hands. Her eyes were wide with fresh, unimaginable horror as she watched her husband being physically restrained on her childhood kitchen floor. She was completely paralyzed by the violent reality unfolding right in front of her. The senior officer grabbed Trevor by the fabric of his jacket and hauled him roughly to his feet. Trevor was gasping for air, his face flushed purple with exertion and absolute terror. The officer looked him dead in the eyes and began to speak in a loud, commanding voice that left zero room for negotiation. He officially placed Trevor under arrest. The officer did not just list a simple misdemeanor. He read out a devastating, life-ruining list of criminal charges that had been coordinated directly with federal investigators earlier that afternoon. The officer informed Trevor that he was being taken into custody for aggravated forgery, massive federal wire fraud felony, elder financial abuse, and attempted assault. Every single charge carried the severe weight of a decade in a federal penitentiary. The officer immediately began reciting the Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The familiar rhythmic cadence of those legal warnings stripped away the final lingering layers of Trevor's arrogant facade. He was no longer a visionary entrepreneur or a wealthy elite. He was just another desperate criminal heading to a concrete holding cell. Realizing that there was absolutely no talking his way out of this meticulously planned trap, Trevor completely snapped. The remaining shreds of his sanity evaporated into the humid kitchen air. He began screaming violently at the top of his lungs. But he did not ask Rachel for forgiveness. He did not beg for her to call a lawyer or to wait for him. Instead, he turned his absolute vitriol entirely onto his wife. He spat venomous, vile insults at Rachel, blaming her for his complete destruction. He screamed that she was a greedy, superficial burden who had ruined his life. He yelled that he only forged the massive loan because her endless, pathetic obsession with luxury brands, expensive cars, and elite social status bled his bank accounts completely dry. He told her she was useless, arrogant, and entirely responsible for pushing him into the arms of the illegal gambling syndicate just to keep up her fake appearances. Rachel sat frozen in her wooden chair, listening to the man she had fiercely defended just 3 days ago tear her soul to shreds with his vicious, cruel honesty. The grand illusion of their perfect elite romance shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of her eyes. The officers had heard enough of his screaming. They grabbed Trevor firmly by both arms and forcefully marched him down the hallway toward the front door. Trevor twisted his head back over his shoulder and locked eyes with me one final time. He screamed that I was a monster, that I had planned this entire execution out of pure spite, and that I would burn for what I had done to him. His voice was a shrill, cracking wail of a man who knew his life was entirely permanently over. I did not say a single word back to him. I simply maintained my steady, emotionless gaze, watching the officers drag him out onto the wet porch. They forced him out into the freezing, relentless storm. The heavy oak front door slammed firmly shut behind them. The loud, decisive thud reverberated through the foundation of the house, cutting off his screaming entirely. The kitchen fell back into a heavy, suffocating silence, leaving only the sound of the rain beating against the glass and my daughter's quiet, broken breathing. The heavy oak front door had slammed shut, but the reverberations seemed to linger in the floorboards for a very long time. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers washed across the wet window panes, casting strange, moving shadows over the kitchen walls. The cruisers finally pulled away down the street, taking the screaming man who had just dismantled my daughter's reality completely out of sight. The house fell back into a suffocating quiet. The only sound left was the steady drumming of the rain outside and the shallow, ragged breathing of the woman sitting across from me. Rachel remained perfectly still in her wooden chair. She was staring blankly at the empty space where her husband had just been violently pinned to the linoleum floor. Her expensive clothes were completely soaked and ruined by the storm, clinging uncomfortably to her shivering frame. The thick manila folder resting on the table between us remained open. The high-resolution photographs of her husband embracing his young mistress stared back at her, providing a brutal, undeniable anchor to the truth. Her entire identity had been built on the illusion of superiority and elite status. Now that illusion was nothing but shattered glass and faded police sirens. Slowly, the profound shock began to wear off, and the crushing weight of her new reality settled firmly onto her shoulders. She realized she had absolutely nothing left in the world. The luxury cars were repossessed by the dealership. The penthouse condo was locked by angry process servers. The bank accounts were entirely frozen. The man she had blindly defended was a federal criminal who had just screamed the most vile, unforgivable insults at her while being dragged away in heavy steel handcuffs. She was completely penniless and deeply publicly humiliated. Rachel finally lifted her head and looked across the table at me. Her eyes were red and swollen, swimming with fresh, heavy tears. The arrogant, entitled woman who had demanded my apology at a steakhouse was entirely gone. In her place sat a terrified, vulnerable child who had just scraped her knees on the pavement and was desperately looking for her father to apply a bandage and make the pain disappear forever. She leaned forward, gripping the wet edge of the wooden table with trembling fingers. Her voice shook uncontrollably as she began to speak. She asked me what she was supposed to do now. She cried that she had nowhere to go and that all her wealthy friends had stopped answering her text messages the exact moment the eviction notice was posted on her door. She looked around the warm, familiar kitchen of her childhood home. She asked if she could go upstairs and sleep in her old bedroom, just for a few nights, until she could figure out a solid plan. She begged me to write a large check so she could hire a ruthless divorce lawyer to destroy Trevor in family court. She pleaded for a financial safety net, assuming that because I had exposed the fraud, I would naturally step back into my traditional role as her silent, limitless provider. She honestly expected me to walk around the table, wrap my arms around her shaking shoulders, and tell her that everything was going to be all right. She expected me to rebuild her life from scratch, because I was her father, and that is what I had always done. I had spent 40 long years shielding her from the harsh, unforgiving consequences of the real world. I had paid for her mistakes. I had funded her arrogance. I had built a protective financial bubble around her so thick that she never had to learn how to truly survive on her own. I sat in my chair and looked at her. I did not feel a sudden rush of paternal warmth. I did not feel the familiar agonizing urge to rescue my little girl. I felt nothing but a profound, cold clarity. I realized in that exact moment that if I opened my wallet and invited her to sleep upstairs, I would be committing the ultimate act of cruelty. I would be confirming her dangerous belief that she never had to face the consequences of her own actions. If I saved her tonight, she would never learn how to be a strong, independent human being. She would simply find another flashy parasite to cling to, and the endless cycle of toxic entitlement would continue until the day I died. I kept my hands resting calmly on my lap. I looked directly into her tear-filled eyes and spoke with a quiet, steady voice that left absolutely no room for negotiation or debate. I told her that she could not sleep in her old bedroom. I told her that I would not write a check for a high-priced divorce attorney. I told her that I was not going to fix this terrible mess, because this was a mess she had actively helped create with her own blind arrogance. Rachel gasped, as if I had thrown a glass of freezing water directly into her face. She asked me how I could possibly be so heartless. She cried out that she was my only family, and that a real loving father would never abandon his daughter at the lowest, most dangerous point in her entire life. She tried to use her tears as a weapon, just like she had done 100 times before when she wanted to manipulate me into opening my checkbook. I did not raise my voice or show any sign of anger. I simply reminded her of the cruel words she had screamed at me 3 days ago in the middle of a crowded restaurant. I repeated her exact sentence slowly and deliberately so she could hear the full weight of her own cruelty. I told her that she had demanded I apologize to her husband right now, or I was no longer her father. I watched her face turn completely pale as the memory of her own vicious behavior washed over her. I told her that she had made her choice very clearly that night. She had chosen a lying, parasitic fraud over the man who had bled for 40 years to put food on her table. She had demanded that I sever our relationship unless I submitted to her total disrespect. I told her that I was simply honoring her direct request. I was no longer the foolish father she could manipulate with fake tears. I was no longer the silent bank account she could drain to fund her luxurious illusion. I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out 3 small, ordinary items. I placed them gently onto the oak table, sliding them across the smooth surface until they rested right next to the open folder of criminal evidence. The first item was a preloaded blue plastic bus pass for the city transit system. The second item was a printed piece of paper containing the names and addresses of 3 safe, affordable motels located on the outer edge of town. The third item was a simple black and white business card for a reputable public defender who handled messy legal separations for clients without significant financial means. Rachel stared at the 3 items resting on the wood. She did not reach out to take them. She looked at the blue bus pass as if it were an alien object. She had not taken public transportation in over a decade. She looked at the printed list of cheap motels and then back at me, and her eyes silently pleading for me to say it was all a harsh lesson and that she could stay. But my expression remained carved from solid, unyielding stone. I told her that she needed to learn how the real world actually works. I told her that out in the real world, respect is earned, and money is the product of actual hard physical labor, not sheer entitlement. I explained that she was going to have to find a minimum wage job, pay her own rent, and navigate her messy divorce using the public resources available to everyday working people. I told her that the luxury ride was permanently, completely over. She began to sob again, burying her wet face deep into her hands. She cried that she did not know how to do any of those things. She cried that she was too scared to go to a cheap motel by herself in the middle of a heavy storm. I felt a tiny brief flicker of sorrow deep in my chest, but I immediately extinguished it. The pain she was feeling right now was the absolute only medicine that could possibly cure the deep rot in her soul. I told her that fear is a wonderful teacher and that she would figure it out because she had absolutely no other choice left. I stood up from my chair and looked down at the woman sitting at my table. I felt a strange, profound sense of finality settling over the kitchen. I told Rachel to take the items on the table. I instructed her to pick up her wet plastic bags from the front porch. I told her that she needed to leave my house immediately and that she should not ever return until she had learned how to stand on her own 2 feet and treat people with genuine respect. I turned my back to her and walked slowly down the hallway without saying another word. The heavy rains of that night eventually washed away into a crisp and quiet autumn. The weeks passed with a relentless mechanical rhythm. The legal system, which Trevor had always assumed was merely a playground for the wealthy, finally closed its steel jaws around him. Carmichael and the forensic accountant had handed the federal prosecutors an absolute masterpiece of criminal evidence. There were no loopholes left to exploit. There were no clever corporate defenses that could explain away a forged notary seal or the stolen funds wired to illegal gambling syndicates. Trevor attempted to fight back at first. He sat in the county jail wearing a bright orange jumpsuit, draining the last of his pride, trying to convince a deeply exhausted public defender that he was a victim of a massive conspiracy. But the sheer volume of high-definition video footage, digital bank records, and recorded confessions was a mountain he simply could not climb over. The federal prosecutors did not even break a sweat. They offered him a single brutal plea deal. They presented him with a choice between going to trial and facing 20 years or pleading guilty to the wire fraud and forgery charges for a guaranteed sentence of 7 years in a federal penitentiary. Faced with the absolute certainty of his own destruction, the arrogant tech executive completely folded. He signed the plea agreement with a trembling hand. The day of his sentencing was a quiet, pathetic affair. I did not attend. Carmichael sent me a brief message confirming the outcome. Trevor stood before a federal judge stripped of his custom-tailored suits and his expensive watch, and wept as the gavel came down. 7 years. For 7 years he would live in a concrete box, told when to eat, when to sleep, and when to speak. The illusion of his elite superiority was permanently buried behind thick walls of razor wire. He was finally learning the true cost of stealing from a man who built his life with calloused hands. While Trevor traded his luxury penthouse for a prison cell, Rachel was learning her own brutal lesson out in the cold reality of the working world. The transition from a life of bottomless entitlement to one of absolute survival was a harsh and unforgiving fall. The eviction from her downtown condo was swift. Without my credit to protect her, and with her husband legally declared a federal fraudster, every door in the city slammed shut in her face. The friends she had spent thousands of dollars entertaining completely vanished. They stopped answering her messages the very same day the repo men towed her luxury vehicle away. She was forced to move into a cramped, drafty studio apartment on the industrial outskirts of town. It was the kind of neighborhood where the streetlights always flickered and the sound of heavy traffic rattled the thin window panes all night long. There was no concierge to greet her in the morning. There was no imported marble on the countertops. There was only a stained linoleum floor and a radiator that clanked loudly when the temperature dropped. To pay her rent, the woman who used to complain about the quality of the valets at five-star restaurants was forced to take a minimum wage job as a cashier at a local grocery store. For 8 hours a day, she had to stand on her feet behind a loud scanning register. She had to wear a cheap polyester uniform shirt and a plastic name tag. She had to smile and apologize to angry customers, complaining about expired coupons. She had to bag heavy groceries until her hands ached and her back throbbed with exhaustion. For the first time in her entire 32 years of life, Rachel was learning exactly how many hours of physical pain it took to earn $50. She was learning that the world did not care about her delicate feelings or her past status. She was discovering that out here in the real world, you only eat if you work. As the long, grueling weeks turned into months, the isolation must have become absolutely suffocating for her. The silence from my end was total and complete. I did not call. I did not send money. I did not drive by her new apartment to check on her. I maintained a wall of absolute silence. Eventually, the letters started arriving. They came in cheap, plain white envelopes written on lined notebook paper. The handwriting was shaky and hurried. I would walk out to my mailbox in the crisp morning air, pull out the envelopes and bring them back to my kitchen table. I opened the very first one with a small, quiet hope buried deep in the back of my mind. I hoped that the harsh medicine of the real world had finally cured her entitlement. I hoped to read a genuine apology from a daughter who had finally recognized the depth of her own cruelty. But as I read the words scrawled across the page, that tiny flicker of hope was completely extinguished. The letters were filled with a desperate, superficial regret. Rachel wrote about how much her feet hurt at the grocery store. She wrote about how lonely her tiny apartment felt at night. She said she was sorry that things had gotten so out of hand, but she never once took actual accountability for her own actions. Every single letter was a masterclass in shifting the blame. She wrote that Trevor had manipulated her completely. She claimed she was just a naive victim of his lies. She blamed the lawyers for being too harsh. She blamed the legal system for moving too fast. She even subtly blamed me for letting things escalate to the point of police involvement. She wrote that a real father would have handled the situation quietly, to protect his daughter's reputation. She completely ignored the fact that she had demanded I apologize to her abuser. She ignored the fact that she had screamed at me telling me I was no longer her father. She ignored her own complicity in the emotional abuse she rained down on me for years. She was sorry that she was poor. She was sorry that she was uncomfortable. But she was not truly sorry for what she had done to me. The entitlement was still there, hiding just beneath the surface of her tears, waiting for a chance to manipulate me back into opening my wallet. I did not feel a sudden urge to write back. I did not feel the agonizing heartbreak that had haunted me for so long. I simply folded the notebook paper back into its cheap envelope. I walked down the hallway to my home office. I opened the bottom drawer of my heavy wooden filing cabinet and dropped the letter inside. Every week, a new letter would arrive, and every week I would read it, fold it, and file it away in the exact same drawer. I did not throw them in the fire. I kept them as a quiet physical reminder of exactly why I had to remain strong. They were proof that my decision was the absolute right one. I had finally accepted the hardest truth a parent can ever face. The little girl I had raised, the one who used to hold my hand and look up at me with genuine love, was gone. The woman writing those letters was a stranger. She was a product of a toxic illusion that I had foolishly helped build. The only way to truly love her now was to let her face the fire completely alone. The toxic dynamic that had suffocated me for so many years was permanently and completely severed. I no longer woke up feeling the heavy, crushing anxiety of how I was going to fix their next disaster. I no longer walked on eggshells in my own life trying to appease their endless demands. The invisible strings of guilt and obligation were cut clean through. I had survived the collapse of my family, and for the first time since my beautiful wife passed away, I felt ready to finally start living again. The autumn winds eventually stripped the trees bare, leaving behind the cold and quiet clarity of winter. The legal storm had completely passed. The court dates were over, and the noise of the city felt entirely distant. I found myself standing in the center of my large suburban home, listening to the absolute stillness. For decades, this house had been the epicenter of my entire universe. I had painted every wall and repaired every creaking floorboard. I had planted the oak tree in the backyard and watched it grow tall and strong. I had filled these rooms with laughter and hope alongside my beautiful wife, Evelyn. But as I walked through the empty hallways, touching the door frames and looking at the bare spaces where photographs used to hang, I realized something profound. The soul of this house had departed the very same day Evelyn took her last breath. What remained was simply wood and concrete, and a heavy collection of ghosts that no longer served me. It was time to finally let go. I picked up my phone and called a premier real estate agent. I did not ask for a lengthy consultation or an emotional appraisal. I instructed him to list the suburban property immediately. I also told him to list the lakeside cabin, the very same cabin that had sparked this entire vicious ordeal, the cabin where my wife had spent her final peaceful days. Selling it was not a surrender. It was a deliberate act of profound liberation. The cabin was a beautiful memory, but I refused to let it become a stagnant monument or a lingering target for future greed. Within 2 short weeks, both properties sparked massive bidding wars. I accepted all cash offers from young families who were eager to build their own lives. I signed the closing documents with a steady hand. The massive sums of money were wired directly into my private holding accounts. I handed over the keys without shedding a single tear. I was entirely free from the physical anchors of my past. With the properties completely liquidated, I drove downtown to meet my lawyer Carmichael one last time. We sat in his familiar glass corner office overlooking the sprawling city. I told him it was time to finalize the absolute structure of my legacy. I had spent my entire life working until my hands bled to build a fortune for a family that ultimately tried to destroy me. I was never going to allow that money to become a weapon or a crutch again. I instructed Carmichael to draft an irrevocable blind trust. It was the most ironclad, restrictive financial document his firm had ever created. I took every single penny of my multi-million-dollar estate and locked it entirely away behind impenetrable legal walls. I was very specific about the terms of the trust. I completely bypassed my daughter Rachel. She was explicitly written out of any direct immediate inheritance. I instructed the legal team that the vast majority of the fortune was to be held strictly for the education and establishment of any future great-grandchildren. The money would sit safely in diversified investments growing quietly in the dark for decades. As for Rachel, I left her a single deeply conditional window of opportunity. The trust stipulated that she could not access even a fraction of a percent of the funds until she could provide 10 consecutive years of flawless audited tax returns proving absolute financial independence. She had to show a full decade of holding down a legitimate job, paying her own rent, and living entirely within her means without borrowing a single dime. Carmichael read the stipulations back to me with a look of deep professional admiration. He asked me if I was absolutely certain about making the terms so incredibly severe. I looked him dead in the eyes and told him I had never been more certain of anything in my entire life. If Rachel truly learned the harsh lessons of the real world, she would eventually earn her way back into a life of stability. If she refused to change, she would never touch a single dollar of my hard-earned money. It was the ultimate act of tough love. I was finally giving her the gift of profound, undeniable accountability. I picked up the heavy ink pen and signed my name on the bottom line. I felt a massive, suffocating weight permanently lift off my shoulders. The fortune was safe, and my duty as a provider was completely, officially finished. The next morning, I walked onto the sprawling lot of a premium recreational vehicle dealership. I did not look at luxury sports cars or useless status symbols. I walked straight toward a top-of-the-line, heavy-duty motorhome. It was a magnificent piece of machinery built for endurance and absolute comfort. It had a sleek silver exterior, a powerful diesel engine, and an interior that rivaled any upscale apartment. It possessed a full kitchen, a comfortable bedroom, and large panoramic windows designed to take in the vast beauty of the country. I paid for the vehicle entirely in cash. The salesman handed me the heavy keys with a wide, astonished smile. He asked me where I was planning to take such a beautiful machine. I smiled a genuine, relaxed smile and told him I was going absolutely everywhere. I spent the next 2 days outfitting the motorhome with everything I needed. I packed my most comfortable clothes, my favorite books, and my trusted toolbox. I left behind the expensive suits and the heavy burdens of my past life. I climbed into the comfortable captain's chair and started the massive diesel engine. The deep, powerful rumble vibrated through the floorboards, filling me with an incredible sense of anticipation. I shifted the heavy vehicle into gear and pulled out of the dealership lot. I drove through the familiar suburban streets one last time. I passed the grocery stores and the parks where I had spent so many decades playing the role of the dutiful, sacrificing father. I did not feel a single pang of regret. I navigated the large motorhome onto the northbound interstate, leaving the crowded, noisy city shrinking in my rearview mirror. The highway stretched out before me like a massive, endless ribbon of absolute possibility. The dense traffic of the suburbs eventually gave way to the wide, open spaces of the countryside. The air coming through the open window felt crisp and remarkably clean. Ahead of me, the majestic peaks of the mountains rose up against the bright blue sky. They stood tall and unyielding, capped with the very first snows of the season. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator, feeling the sheer power of the engine carrying me forward. I was no longer a mechanic tied to a grueling schedule. I was no longer a secret bank account for ungrateful heirs. I was no longer a man living in the shadow of a toxic family dynamic. I was completely unburdened. I was a man who had survived the absolute worst betrayal imaginable and emerged entirely victorious. I watched the pine trees blur past the large windshield, and for the first time in my 64 years, I was finally living my life strictly, entirely on my own terms. The road ahead was beautifully unwritten, and I had all the time in the world to explore it. The greatest lesson Warren's journey teaches us is that financial enabling is not a substitute for genuine love. In fact, it often breeds the very entitlement that destroys a family. We frequently believe that shielding our children from the harsh consequences of the real world is an act of protection, but providing an endless safety net only paralyzes their ability to grow into resilient, accountable adults. True love sometimes requires making the agonizing choice to walk away, sever the toxic ties, and let them fall. Respect cannot be bought with a blank check, and your dignity is never an acceptable price for keeping the peace. If Warren's journey of reclaiming his worth resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel for more powerful life stories, and let us know in the comments how you handle setting healthy boundaries in your own life.